Everyone turned toward him. This small boy sitting among adults, and in that moment he spoke a truth that cut through everything. I put an arm around Ethan and said gently, "That's right, buddy. I'm not a loser, and you never let anyone make you feel small when you know who you are." The room stayed quiet, the soft glow of Christmas lights flickering around us. For the first time in years, Richard had nothing to say. His authority had crumbled, his laughter silenced, his pride stripped away. I stood slowly, pushing my chair back. "Enjoy the rest of your dinner," I said evenly. "But from now on you'll manage it without my help." My voice was calm, but the finality was unmistakable. Richard's lips trembled. He opened his mouth, but no words came. He stared at me, pale and defeated, stripped of the carefully crafted image he had spent years building. I knew in that moment he finally realized what he had lost. Claire rose beside me, slipping her hand into mine. She looked at her father one last time, her expression firm. "We're done, Dad. We've carried this weight long enough." Together, we took Ethan's hand and walked toward the door. Behind us, the silence at the table spoke louder than any words ever could. For years, Richard had laughed at my expense, secure in the belief I would never speak up, that I would keep carrying his burdens quietly. But tonight the roles had shifted. The man he had mocked was no longer his crutch, and in doing so I had given my son a lesson he would never forget. The drive home felt different from any other Christmas spent at Richard's house. Snow fell gently. The streets were quiet, and the car was filled with a peace I hadn't known in years. For the first time, I didn't carry the weight of shame or resentment. Instead, a calm strength settled over me, the kind that comes only after you finally do what should have been done long ago. Ethan sat in the back seat, clutching his toy truck, his eyes bright with the wonder of a child who had just witnessed something important. He didn't understand the years of sacrifice, the financial strain, or the toxic patterns we had endured. But he understood this. His father had stood tall. He had seen me refuse to be disrespected, and heard me speak the truth without fear. That was enough. That was the lesson he would carry forever. Claire rested her head against my shoulder. "I should have said something years ago," she whispered. "I let him walk over you because I was scared of losing family. But tonight you showed me that family isn't just blood when it comes with humiliation. Family is respect. Family is honesty. And you gave us both." Her words meant more than anything else. For years, I had worried my silence had created distance between us, that she might see me the way Richard had described me. Steady but small, dependable but unremarkable. That night proved she had always seen me for who I truly was, and she was proud. That pride mattered more than anything. In the days that followed, silence from Richard's house was deafening. No calls, no messages, no apologies. Daniel remained quiet, humbled by the truth about who had paid for his education. Margaret sent a brief note to Claire, not me, expressing hope we could move on. But there was no anger in their silence, only the stunned realization that the person they had relied on for so long was no longer at their disposal. They had to face the consequences of years of arrogance and entitlement. At first, part of me hesitated. I had always believed in helping others, and even after everything, cutting off support felt harsh. But then I remembered the way Richard had looked at me when he called me a loser. He had believed it, truly believed it, enough to laugh at me in front of Claire and Ethan. That belief existed only because I had allowed him to rely on me without expecting respect in return. By stopping, I wasn't punishing him. I was teaching him the one lesson left to teach. Dignity cannot be bought, and disrespect will no longer be tolerated. What surprised me most was how light I felt. I had expected guilt, self-doubt, second-guessing. Instead, I felt stronger, more certain of myself, more present with my own family. Without the constant drain of supporting someone who mocked me, I could focus on building the life I wanted for Claire and Ethan. I could finally invest my energy into us, not into propping up Richard's pride. A few days later, Ethan said something that stayed with me forever. We were sitting on the couch, his little hands fidgeting with a toy, and he looked up with serious eyes. "Dad, you're not a loser. You're the strongest person I know." I hugged him tightly, my throat thick with emotion. That moment confirmed that what I had done at that table mattered. It wasn't just about reclaiming my dignity. It was about giving him an example of self-respect, of standing firm even when it's hard. Looking back, I realized that confrontation wasn't just about a single insult on a Christmas night. It was about years of imbalance, years of sacrifice taken for granted, years of quiet endurance mistaken for weakness. Standing up that night became a turning point, not just for me, but for my whole family. It changed how Claire saw me, how Ethan would remember me, and how Richard would have to reckon with his own dependence. The lesson I carry with me now is simple but powerful. Providing for others is meaningless if it costs you your self-worth. Helping family is noble, but when that help becomes a tool for disrespect, it poisons everyone. True strength isn't measured by how much you can carry. It's measured by knowing when to set the burden down. If you've ever felt like you were giving and giving while someone mocked or dismissed you, remember this. Your silence may keep the peace, but it also teaches others that your sacrifices are theirs to exploit. The moment you speak your truth, you reclaim not just your dignity, but your future. That Christmas dinner marked the end of one chapter and the start of another. I walked away not as the silent provider, but as a man who finally demanded the respect he deserved. And in doing so, I became the kind of example I wanted Ethan to remember for the rest of his life. If this story resonates with you, share it with someone who might need to hear it and let me know your thoughts. Have you ever had to stand up for yourself after years of giving? I'd love to hear your story. And if you want more real-life stories that inspire and empower, make sure you subscribe so you don't miss the next one. The hospital bill after Richard's surgery, which I had paid in full to protect his credit, flashed in my mind. The thousands that vanished from my savings for Daniel's tuition, never once acknowledged with a thank you. Each memory wasn't fuel for anger, it was fuel for certainty. Richard smirked, misreading my silence as usual. See, he knows he's in the right. A good sport takes a hit and keeps smiling. That's why I like him. He knows his place. His words confirmed what I already knew. He believed my patience was weakness. My quiet endurance was submission. I leaned back in my chair and let a small smile curve my lips. Not the polite, forced smile I had worn for years, but the smile of a man finally seeing his own worth. I cleared my throat and the sound cut through the hum of conversation. The room quieted. Daniel stopped mid-laugh. Margaret looked up. Even Ethan set down his fork. All eyes were on me. Richard leaned forward, expecting a self-deprecating joke, expecting me to confirm his authority in front of the family. That was not what he would get. The words formed in my mind with precision, sharp and steady. I would speak a truth he had never faced. I would tell him he was no longer being carried, that the lifeline he mocked was the very thing keeping him afloat. He thought he was exposing weakness, but tonight I would expose his dependence. Claire's whisper reached me under the table. Think carefully. I nodded once, but my decision was already made. This was no longer only about me. It was about her. about freeing her from the burden of watching her husband be belittled. It was about protecting Ethan from growing up in a home where kindness was mistaken for weakness. I looked at my son again, his wide, trusting eyes fixed on me, and I knew these words would stay with him forever. Not just what I said, but how I carried myself. I turned back to Richard, and for the first time I felt taller than him. My voice was calm, steady. My heart beat even, grounded in certainty. "Richard," I said, my tone measured, "you want to know how it feels to be a loser? It feels like sitting here for years taking your insults while I paid your bills, kept your house in order, and made sure your family had food on this table. It feels like carrying a man who never once had the decency to say thank you." The room froze. Claire gasped softly. Margaret's fork hit her plate with a quiet clatter. Daniel straightened in his chair. His smirk vanished. Ethan's eyes widened. Richard's grin faded, his face flushing red, then paling entirely. But I was not done. I leaned forward, still steady, still calm. "And from tonight on it feels like freedom," I said. "Because this loser will no longer be paying your bills." Silence followed, thick and absolute. For the first time in years, Richard had nothing to say. His mouth opened, closed, opened again, but no words came. The authority he had clung to so tightly crumbled instantly. I felt a weight lift from my shoulders. I had made my choice, and there was no turning back. My words fell like stones into still water, sending ripples through the room. For years, Richard had controlled the table with his voice, his laughter, his sharp remarks. Now, for the first time, it was silent. The only sound in the room was the faint hum of Christmas music from the living room speakers. Richard stared at me, mouth slightly open, as if my words had knocked the air out of him. Margaret's fork slipped from her fingers and clattered onto her plate. She froze, eyes flicking between Richard and me. Daniel's smirk disappeared, his glass lowering slowly until it rested softly on the table. Claire pressed her lips together, her hand still holding mine under the table, this time with a hint of relief rather than fear. Ethan looked at me wide-eyed, his gaze shimmering with something new, a pride I had never seen in him before. Richard cleared his throat, forcing a laugh that didn't reach his eyes. "You're joking," he said, voice strained. "Really, that's a good one, hilarious." His eyes darted to the others, seeking the familiar laughter that always followed his remarks. But none came. The silence grew heavier with each passing second. "I'm not joking," I said, my voice calm, steady, louder than I expected, filling the room in a way it never had before. "I've paid your mortgage, your medical bills, Daniel's tuition. I've covered repairs, groceries, everything you pretended came from you. And you sit here in front of my son and call me a loser." Daniel's face turned red. "Wait, you paid my tuition?" His smugness vanished, replaced by disbelief. I met his gaze directly. "Every semester. You think your father did? He never had the money. It came from me, from the hours I worked while you attended school without a care." Daniel's mouth opened, but no words came. His eyes shifted to his father, the betrayal plain. For the first time, he saw that his father's pride was built on someone else's sacrifice. Margaret looked down at her lap, hands trembling as she twisted her napkin. She had always suspected the truth on some level, but hearing it spoken aloud stripped away the last of her denial. Tears welled in her eyes. Not just from shame, but from realizing she had allowed Richard's arrogance to blind her to reality. Richard's face grew pale, his bravado crumbling under the weight of my words. He tried to recover, voice rising in a strained tone. "You think you can sit there and embarrass me in front of my family? You think you can walk away after everything I've done for them? All you've done?" I leaned forward, voice sharp but controlled. You've taken. You've mocked. You've leaned on me while pretending to stand tall. You've humiliated me in the same breath you've relied on me. That ends tonight." The tension shattered like glass. Claire, who had remained quiet for so long, finally spoke, voice strong and unwavering. "Dad, he's right. You've treated him terribly while letting him hold this family together. I've watched him work himself to exhaustion, so you could sit here and play the proud father. And I let it continue because I didn't want to upset you, but enough is enough." Richard turned to her, disbelief etched across his face. "Claire, you don't mean that." She met his eyes with the same steadiness I had shown. "I do, and I'm ashamed I didn't say it sooner." The weight of her words hit harder than mine. She was his daughter, his pride, his defender. To hear her side with me, to see her speak the truth, broke something in him. He looked at Margaret, but she didn't defend him. He looked at Daniel, but Daniel sat stiff, silent, pale. Ethan shifted beside me, his small voice breaking the stillness. "Dad's not a loser." His words were simple, innocent, but they landed heavier than anything else anyone had said that night. Ethan sat beside me, happily spooning mashed potatoes onto his plate while softly humming a carol he'd heard on the radio. For him, the evening was everything Christmas should be: food, family, and the promise of presents waiting under the tree. Watching him helped ground me, though my attention kept drifting back to Richard. I knew the moment was coming. It always did. Richard had never been able to stand quiet. He filled every pause with a story, a jab, or a laugh at someone's expense. At first he kept it light. He teased Margaret about fussing too much over the turkey, poked fun at Daniel for never lifting a hand around the house, and even made a joke about his own growing belly. The room responded with laughter, relieved to have him in his usual role. But then, as always, his gaze shifted toward me. He asked about my job with that casual tone that was never truly casual. I answered honestly. Work was steady, I was grateful, and I had enough to provide for my family. He nodded, then twisted my words into his stage act. "Steady work, huh?" he said, lifting his glass. "That's another way of saying dull. The man works, and what does he have to show for it? No flashy car, no boat, no big house, just steady. Am I right, everyone?" Laughter erupted around the table. Daniel shook his head, grinning as if the idea of a life like mine was laughable. Margaret lowered her eyes and busied herself with her food. Claire's hand brushed against my leg under the table, a quiet plea not to take the bait. I smiled faintly and took a sip of water, but the words still burned. I thought about the double shifts I'd worked, the trips we never took, the corners I'd cut, all so I could keep Richard's household from falling apart. To hear him frame me as ordinary, small, unworthy, it tightened something in my chest. Richard leaned forward, encouraged by the laughter, his voice booming. "You know what I admire about this guy?" he said, jabbing his finger toward me. "He's dependable. Always shows up. Always pays up. The perfect son-in-law, a man you can count on for everything." To anyone else it might have sounded like praise, but I heard the truth beneath it. He was reminding everyone that when he failed, I covered the gap. When he wanted to boast as the provider, I made it possible. That so-called dependability wasn't respect. It was a chain he'd looped around my neck. Daniel lifted his glass toward me, smirking. "Yeah, cheers to the guy who keeps this family afloat. Without him, where would we be?" His laughter made it clear he thought it was a joke. Claire's voice cut through, sharp with embarrassment. "That's enough, Daniel." She looked to her father as well, her eyes pleading. "Stop." Richard waved her off, chuckling. "Relax, sweetheart. We're just having fun. He knows I'm kidding. Don't you, son? He turned to me, face flushed from wine, daring me to disagree. I nodded once, though my jaw locked tight. Ethan's fork was frozen halfway to his mouth, his eyes wide on me. He was too young to untangle the layers of what was happening, but he felt the weight in the room. Kids always do. He knew his grandfather was mocking me, and he was waiting to see if I'd bend or stand. The laughter thinned as people turned back to their plates, but Richard wasn't finished. He rarely was. After another swallow of wine, he leaned back, folded his arms, and grinned wide enough to silence the table again. "So tell me," he said, his voice carrying, his eyes still on me. "How does it feel to be a loser?" The words landed hard, heavy and sharp. Loser. They reverberated in my mind, sinking deep. Daniel laughed loudly, his amusement unrestrained. Margaret pressed a hand to her mouth, pretending to cough, but I caught the twitch at the corners of her lips. Even Claire let out a nervous chuckle, not because she agreed, but to fill the unbearable silence. Only Ethan stayed still, his wide eyes locked on me, his expression too serious for a child on Christmas. In that instant, I understood this was no longer about swallowing my pride for the sake of peace. It was about the example I would set for my son. Was I going to teach him that a man should accept humiliation silently, even when he carried everyone else? Or was I going to show him that respect is earned and demanded no matter the cost? I scanned the table. Richard's grin lingered, expecting me to laugh at myself. Daniel leaned back, smug and satisfied. Margaret kept her gaze down, quiet. Claire's face was pale, her hand trembling slightly as it gripped her glass. I felt the warmth in my chest harden into something cold and deliberate. All the years of sacrifice, the countless transfers, the long nights spent working, everything crystallized in that moment. This was no longer a joke. This was the moment to decide whether I would continue letting them define me as less than I was. I smiled, not with amusement, but with certainty. I knew exactly what I was about to say, and I knew it would shift everything. Richard's laughter rang through the dining room, but I felt an unexpected calm. The word loser hovered in the air, but instead of wounding me, it brought clarity. For years I had bitten my tongue at this same table, pretending his jabs were harmless, pretending his words didn't slice deeper each holiday. This time was different. Ethan's eyes were on me, searching for a lesson in how to handle insult. If I let it slide again, I would teach him that it was acceptable for a man to give everything and still be treated with contempt. That was not a lesson I would let him learn. I set my fork down slowly, deliberately, without a sound. I met Richard's eyes and held them, letting him see that I would not follow the script he expected. His grin faltered, as though he realized this was not the usual performance. For the first time in years, I felt a shift inside me. I was no longer the silent provider, no longer the man who gave and gave while being treated as less. I was ready to reclaim my dignity. The decision crystallized in my mind with unprecedented clarity. I would not raise my voice. I would not lash out. I would not grant him the satisfaction of seeing me break. Instead, I would wield the truth. The truth was more powerful than any insult. The truth was what kept him clothed and fed. The truth was what kept this house standing. The truth allowed him to play patriarch while I was expected to vanish. Tonight I would no longer be invisible. Claire noticed the change first. Her hand tightened on my leg under the table, her eyes widening. She whispered, "Please don't." But it was too late. I returned her a calm, reassuring look, not anger but resolve. This wasn't about revenge. It was about restoring balance. I thought back to every moment that had led to this point. The night Margaret had called in tears because the mortgage was overdue, and I had transferred the money immediately, without a question. Everything led to this. The scent of roasted turkey and cinnamon pie filled the air, wrapping the house in holiday warmth. The tree sparkled with ornaments and laughter rose around the long dining table. Plates clattered, glasses clinked, and for a moment it felt like Christmas was exactly what it should be: light and joy. Then Richard, my father-in-law, leaned back in his chair. With a smug smile, he looked straight at me and asked, "So what's it like being such a failure?" His words sliced through the laughter like glass breaking. The room erupted again, this time at my expense. His son, Daniel, nearly spilled his wine from laughing so hard. My mother-in-law, Margaret, pressed her lips together, but the corners of her mouth betrayed her amusement. Even my wife, Claire, let out a nervous chuckle, as though trying to smooth over the sharpness, but I didn't laugh. I sat steady, my son Ethan staring at me with wide, questioning eyes. He was waiting to see how I would react. I forced a thin smile and replied evenly, "Tell me, Richard, how does it feel to know this failure won't be paying your bills anymore?" Silence fell. The laughter froze in the air. Richard's face drained of color, his grin dissolving into a slack jaw. For the first time all night he was speechless. That morning had begun like every Christmas morning in our home. Claire and I woke early. The heaters hummed, the only sound in the house. Ethan burst into our room before the sun was up, his messy hair sticking in every direction, his excitement impossible to contain. "Dad, Mom, it's Christmas. Just one present before we leave?" he pleaded. We caved, of course. He tore into a box and pulled out the red toy truck he had begged for all year. His squeal of joy filled the room, and for a few precious minutes it felt like nothing could spoil the day. But I knew what the evening would bring. Christmas at Richard's was never just Christmas, it was his stage. He relished the role of the patriarch. Loud jokes, sharp jabs, always making sure everyone remembered who held the spotlight. What the rest of the family refused to say out loud was that the very life he flaunted was balanced on money I had quietly provided. The mortgage kept current, my transfers, repairs after the roof caved in, my checks, Daniel's college tuition, my signature on the wire. Richard treated it like tribute, as though marrying his daughter bound me to bankroll his pride. The drive over was quiet. Claire reached across the console, her hand finding mine. "I know tonight isn't easy," she whispered, "but thank you. They need us." Her voice carried no judgment, only love. She had grown up watching her mother cover for Richard's arrogance and mistakes, and Daniel coasting along on unearned support. She still wanted to believe helping them was the right thing, that family required sacrifice. I wanted to believe it too, but each year it cost me more. From the outside, their house looked every bit the picture of holiday warmth. Strings of lights along the roofline, a wreath glowing on the door, faint carols drifting through the windows. Inside, Margaret greeted us with her soft smile and gentle voice. She hugged Ethan tightly, whispering, "Merry Christmas, sweetheart," in his ear. When she hugged me, there was always a pause in her embrace, as though she carried words she never dared to say. Daniel was already sunk into the recliner when we walked in, a drink balanced lazily in his hand. His smirk never changed, the same smug curve that said he knew I was the one quietly keeping his world intact, but he'd never admit it. He lifted his glass as if we were old friends. "Good to see you, man. Work treating you all right? Not chewing you up too much?" His voice carried that polished edge of fake concern that made my jaw tighten. Richard made his entrance moments later, as loud and commanding as always. He clapped me on the back with enough force to nearly spill my glass. "There he is," he boomed. My son-in-law. The quiet one, always working, never talking. "Tonight we'll finally get you loosened up." Laughter rippled around the room, and I gave the practiced, polite smile, even as my chest tightened under the weight of the same old ritual. Margaret had outdone herself in the kitchen. The table overflowed with roasted turkey, mashed potatoes, cranberry sauce, and steaming pies. The warmth of the food filled the room, and Ethan's wide eyes darted between the plates and the glittering presents piled under the tree. His innocence reminded me why I endured these evenings year after year. He deserved a Christmas untouched by tension, even if it meant I swallowed every ounce of my pride. As the dishes were passed, chatter circled the table. Daniel bragged about his new job, the one Richard had secured through favors rather than merit. Margaret spoke softly about the church service earlier that day, but Richard interrupted constantly, his voice booming, his stories painting himself as the family's hero. Everyone nodded along, and I played my part, chewing quietly, smiling when expected, letting out the occasional laugh. But inside I kept a different tally. The nights I worked overtime instead of resting, the savings I drained, the vacations I sacrificed, all to prop up the man at the head of the table, the one whose voice drowned out everyone else's. I remembered the hospital bill after his heart scare, my money, his silence. The check that fixed the roof while he claimed the credit. The tuition payments that carried Daniel through college while Richard puffed up his chest, pretending it was his doing. Claire's eyes found mine more than once during dinner. They searched for patience, for the strength she knew I was forcing. She loved her father, even with all his flaws. And she knew the truth, too. She was caught between loyalty and honesty, and I never held it against her. This was her family, her blood. I was only the outsider, the one who gave and gave with nothing but ridicule handed back in return. Still, I reminded myself why I stayed quiet. For Ethan, for Claire, for the thin idea of family, no matter how one-sided. I told myself I could last one more evening, let a few more insults roll past me, and later return to the peace of our own home. But as I watched Richard raise his glass higher than anyone else, his laughter booming, his jokes cutting deeper, something inside me stirred. For years I'd told myself that giving without acknowledgement was strength, that sacrifice was the measure of manhood. But looking around that table, I began to see the truth. It wasn't strength I was building, it was their entitlement. And I knew before the night ended something in me would break the pattern. The first half hour passed in that familiar rhythm of clinking plates and overlapping voices. Margaret urged everyone to take another helping, while Richard's laughter rang loudest of all. And beneath it I could feel the change rising in me, quiet but unstoppable.